During my childhood, when our family visited Jeffersonville, Indiana, crossing the bridges over the Ohio River was always one of the highlights of our trip. As a child looking out the backseat window of the car to the water below, I thought the Ohio River seemed as big as an ocean. It was always a special treat when we would look down and see a fleet of barges go underneath us. From the bridge above, the barges looked like toy boats floating in the water. It was even more special when the belle of Louisville passed by. Watching the old paddle wheel riverboat was like turning a page back in time. I could just picture the riverboat gamblers playing cards and smoking cigars around the tables on the lower deck, the women in long flowing gowns with skirts daintily gathered up in one hand as they ascended winding stairs with beautifully stained woodwork, and waiters dressed in dark suits carrying silver platters of drinks to guests who sat watching the banks of the river pass by. Today, there are 4 bridges connecting Louisville to Jeffersonville, Indiana. So much has changed since I was a child. The oldest bridge, the Big 4 Bridge, was completed in 1895. For its time, the Big 4 was an architectural masterpiece. Today, however, it has little use and has been repurposed as a walking bridge. Visitors from the Indiana side or the Kentucky side are frequently strolling up winding ramps leading to the newly renovated bridge, and it is very common to see walkers and joggers and bicycles and skateboards crossing the bridge on a bright sunny day. The bridge ends in a waterfront park on both sides of the river, and these green expanses are usually filled with children at play, their parents standing near them or talking to other parents, or sitting on a park bench reading a book with one watchful eye towards the children. The George Rogers Clark Memorial Bridge opened to the public in 1929, just weeks after the death of Edward Branham and the Prophet's return to Jeffersonville. Construction on the bridge began in 1928, while the Prophet would have been in Phoenix, Arizona. The opening of the bridge was big news when he started preaching in 1930. It provided quick access to the other side of the river, making travel much easier for residents and opening the door for new job opportunities in Louisville from the Indiana side. No longer did travelers need to wait for the next train to arrive or wait in line for a ferry. They could come and go as they pleased. The George Rogers Clark Memorial Bridge was also very important to the advancement of the message movement. It was the target for one of the prophet's prophecies. For those of us in the message, the bridge itself stood as vindication of the accuracy of the prophet's prophecies. He had said, "And I looked down the river, and there went a bridge, a big, great bridge going across the river. And I counted 16 men that fell off that bridge and drowned. And I went and told Mother, and I told her that I seen it. And they thought I was crazy or something. They thought I was just a little nervous, hysterical child." And 22 years from that time on the same ground went the municipal bridge across, and 16 men lost their lives on it. When I learned that the Prophet was living in Kansas in 1929, and that he began preaching for Roy E. Davis in 1930, the pieces of the puzzle seemed even more disconnected. With Davis's Pentecostal Baptist Church in Louisville instead of Jeffersonville at that time, what made the church more appealing than one of the many local Jeffersonville churches? I became curious as to what it was like in Jeffersonville and Louisville when the Prophet returned from Arizona and Kansas. Since the new bridge would have been big news at the time, the bridge seemed like a good place to start. I remembered some research that another message brother and sister had published, which raised some concerning questions about the Prophet's statements about this new bridge. The couple had set out to prove that his prophecies were accurate, and predictions about the new bridge and its construction also seemed like a good place for them to start. They began collecting historical documents from the time periods before, during, and after the bridge construction. The Prophet had prophesied that 16 men fell to their deaths and drowned during the construction of the George Rogers Clark Memorial Bridge. According to the descriptions given by the prophet and his life stories, he had seen 16 men fall to their deaths during construction of that bridge in a vision as a small child. In that vision, there was a sign that read 22. He said that 22 years from that day, 16 men fell to their deaths. The biggest problem with this vision that I could see from the start was the 22 years. Since construction ended in 1929 and the prophet claimed to have been born in 1909, the prediction must have been made 2 years before his birth. When the researchers learned that the construction was monitored by a Coast Guard life-saving station, they just knew they'd find records of the lives that were lost, vindicating the prophet and his predictions. The two traveled to the National Archives at Atlanta, where they found the collection of logbooks. Exactly 2 lives were lost during construction. The first death happened near the end of the construction in June of 1929. It happened just 1 day after Edward Branham's death. The second one happened in September of 1929. Construction was monitored by the Coast Guard, and the logs were fully detailed. From orders of food and supplies to weather conditions, the Coast Guard logs detailed every event, big or small, that happened during construction. The researchers who published this information were just as surprised as I was to learn that no major loss of life occurred during the construction. Curious, I made a trip to the memorial site at the foot of the bridge on the Jeffersonville side of the river and spoke with a historian on site. He was an older gentleman with a friendly smile and a firm handshake. When I told him the reason that I was curious about the number of deaths on the bridge, he chuckled and walked me into a meeting room on the north side of the building. On the wall were several pictures of the bridge, both during construction and after. In one of them, the much older Big 4 bridge could be seen. He pointed out the difference in construction, something that I was unfamiliar with. When the older bridge was constructed, bridges were built in sections, and it was very dangerous. He informed me that there was a tragic event on the construction of the older bridge. In the 1800s, several men fell to their deaths when a section collapsed. The construction of the new bridge, however, was so successful that the technique was used for future bridges. Though this prophecy did not appear to be correct, I still wondered about the effects this bridge would have had on the prophet's early ministry. If this prophecy really occurred when he was a child, he certainly would have asked about it when he arrived. Did he return to Jeffersonville in 1930, claiming his prophecy was accurate? Or was this a claim that came years after? If he became ordained a minister and began claiming prophecy for an event that the locals knew did not happen, what made them stay with his church? I began to wonder if he introduced his prophecy years later, when it was more difficult to prove. By the 1930s, Louisville, Kentucky was a land of big opportunity. Even as the Great Depression was beginning to cripple the United States economy, workers could find employment in Louisville manufacturing. The George Rogers Clark Memorial Bridge would have made Jeffersonville feel even more connected with Louisville, giving it hope in a time of crisis. Rural Kentucky and Indiana were hit particularly hard during the Great Depression. It is likely that many rural families were migrating to this area to find work. Was this the reason that the prophet returned? Or was his return during the Great Depression merely coincidence? With the opening of the new bridge, it would have only been a few minutes' drive for the prophet to travel to Davis's church in Louisville. Having a population of around 300,000 people, Louisville was much larger than Phoenix, which had just a little over 48,000 people. Jeffersonville only had 12,000 people, but was considered to be part of the Louisville metro area. The church that Roy Davis pastored in Louisville was within walking distance to the new bridge, right in the heart of busy downtown. It was located at 711 East Jefferson, one of the busiest sections of town. With the new bridge allowing automobiles to cross the Ohio River, an influx of Indiana automobiles would have made the city seem far busier than Phoenix. Stores that Jeffersonville customers could only access by boat, train, or trolley were now just a short drive from their homes. At 410 Jefferson Street, locals could play miniature golf. Around them were buildings towering to the sky, providing jobs that were now easily accessible for citizens of Jeffersonville. Some of the buildings were so high that a person could look out of upper windows and see tops of other tall buildings. Some could see across the Ohio River into Jeffersonville. This was certainly not what I imagined for the prophet's first church experience. When I thought about his first experience as a minister, I never really pictured him driving on a busy street in downtown Louisville. Heading to church, he would have crossed the new bridge, driven past trolleys, and had to be careful not to hit pedestrians as they scurried around him. In my mind, I had pictured a humble little church in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and I had pictured Jeffersonville as a small town with just a handful of people. Since he claimed to have been a prophet from a very early age, and some of these prophecies were supposed to be happening by the early 1930s, I had almost expected to find a small following of people gathered around the prophet to see what he would say next. On Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the Louisville Courier-Journal newspaper dedicated most of the Tuesday issue to the newly opened George Rogers Clark Memorial Bridge. Ironically, this day would go down in history as Black Tuesday, the day of the Wall Street crash of 1929. Newspapers could not have predicted the events that the day would bring, and writers filled the entire newspaper with bridge-related history, facts, and more. Articles contained everything from praise to the builders to the history of the bridges themselves. Ralph Modjeski and Frank Masters received well-deserved recognition for their successful project. In fact, Modjeski received the John Fritz Gold Medal for his master craftsmanship. I began looking for an article, any article, that would cause the prophet to believe that men had died during the construction of the bridge. Since he was in town, there was no doubt that he read this issue of the Courier-Journal. It was one of the biggest events in Louisville and Jeffersonville history for several years. One article on page 5 looked promising. The Courier-Journal published a detailed timeline of events of the history of the new bridge. If there was a tragedy during construction, especially as significant as 16 deaths, surely the chronology would mention the event. Sadly, I was unable to find anything that the prophet could use to claim any sort of prophecy when speaking to his church. Using the online newspaper archive subscription that I purchased, I began searching other newspapers for a tragedy involving 16 men. On one particular search, I forgot to enter the date range. As it turned out, 16 men did fall to their deaths in the bridge construction. To my surprise, it happened January 29, 1890 on the Big Four Bridge, almost 2 decades before the prophet was born. This must have been the event that the bridge historian had mentioned to me. I found the life-saving station mentioned in the article from the 1800s, and I remembered descriptions of the life-saving station in the research of the new bridge. This was something that I never really thought about. As dangerous as bridge construction was and is, workers prepared for quick response to save lives. It would have been very difficult for the deaths of 16 men to go unnoticed, regardless of the Coast Guard logs. Had the prophet claimed to have made this prediction as a child before his congregation, they would have had a very easy time disproving the claim. I was beginning to conclude that during his early ministry, the prophet would have never made this claim at all. This made me even more curious about Davis's church in Louisville, and I wanted to know what made the prophet decide to choose a church in Louisville instead of Jeffersonville. If he really became ordained and started preaching in 1930 as he claimed, before Davis moved his church to Jeffersonville, something must have attracted him to Davis's church. I began digging through the old Louisville Courier-Journal newspapers to find something, anything, that would have had enough publicity to attract people from Jeffersonville. To my surprise, I found several articles about Roy Davis. He was gaining quite a bit of publicity, but not the type of publicity that I was looking for. In 1930, the same year that the prophet started preaching, Roy Davis was denounced by Louisville ministers for using the name Baptist for his Pentecostal assembly. Local ministers wanted to make sure that the public was aware that Davis was by no means a Baptist minister, and they did not condone his actions or practices. That year, Davis was in and out of court and in and out of jail. In March, he defrauded one Miss Minnie Burgeon in a scheme attempting to gather enough money to purchase a larger church. In October, Davis was arrested for violation of the Mann Act with a 17-year-old child, Allie Lee Garrison. Under the provisions of the Mann Act, it was illegal for a man to take an underage girl across state lines for the purposes of sex. October 14, 1930, Davis was indicted by a grand jury and started serving a jail sentence. Oddly, 60 women showed up at the court trial to protest. The thought suddenly occurred to me, if the prophet started preaching in 1930 as he claimed, and he was an active, ordained minister in Roy E. Davis's church at the time as he claimed, and the media was publishing the illegal and the immoral activities of Roy E. Davis, there was a good chance that Roy E. Davis himself could provide a glimpse into his church. I found a letter to the editor of the Courier-Journal by a reader upset with Roy E. Davis. Davis had been publicly arguing with M.P. Hunt, who had apparently thoroughly investigated Roy Davis's background and criminal activities in other states. I began searching for previous communications by Roy Davis, and I came across another letter to the editor signed by Roy E. Davis himself. In the article, Davis described the environment inside of his own church during sermons. To appeal to the public, Davis used common events inside the church and associated them with his position on prohibition, which would have been a hot topic in Louisville, especially with all of the distilleries that could have employed many people during the onset of the Great Depression. For Louisville and southern Indiana, prohibition was costing jobs. According to Davis, drunken men sat in the laps of women in the congregation, while drunken women disrupted service by leaving their seats for men. Young, school-age boys and girls were so drunken that they could not walk, according to Davis's description of his congregation. He wrote, "In my own church in this city, I've had to leave the pulpit to raise drunken men out of the laps of members of my congregation. I've had to take women, drunken women, by the arm in the presence of my congregation and lead them to seats. It is not an uncommon thing to see from 1 to a half dozen drunks in my audience." As I read, I tried to reconcile the image that it created with my memories and the message. The prophet's first ministry was far from what I had pictured. Never in a million years would I have imagined the prophet participating in a service with drunkards. I realized that it was time to learn more about the Reverend Roy E. Davis. Why did he leave his church in Louisville to come to Jeffersonville? How was he able to continue preaching after a criminal indictment with an underage girl? What made William Branham decide to continue with Roy Davis after he moved to Jeffersonville? It seemed that there was much more to Roy E. Davis than met the eye. I knew that if I would find more information about Davis, I could unlock the door that held many secrets the prophet had withheld about the origins of the message. It was time to examine the first church that Roy E. Davis started in Jeffersonville.